Okay, so you've inherited an inn. Not just any inn. A purpose-built stone guesthouse standing across from Glastonbury Abbey, put up around 1475 by the abbot himself to house the pilgrims pouring in to see what was, by then, the second richest abbey in England. 14 rooms. A carved facade with the abbey's coat of arms over the door, right next to the king's, oak beams, stone floors, its own cellars. On paper, this looks like the easiest business in medieval England. You didn't have to find your customers. The abbey found them for you, one relic and one miracle story at a time, and all you had to do was catch them on the way through. Here's the catch. Every one of those guests is walking through your door because of somebody else's reputation, not yours. You didn't build the pull, you just built the beds underneath it, and that changes almost everything about how this business actually behaves, what you owe, who you answer to, and what happens to your income the moment the thing driving it stops. Before we get into the books, quick favor, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right where you are. I like seeing how far this reaches and what hour everyone's tuning in at. It's always a little strange to think about how many different clocks are running at once while one video plays. So, let's open this place up. We're going behind the counter of a medieval pilgrimage inn, not the generic roadside tavern you're picturing, something more specific and frankly riskier, and we're going to find out whether the person running it could actually get rich, or whether they were just renting a good view of somebody else's fortune. Start with what Glastonbury Abbey actually was, because it explains everything downstream. By the 14th century, it was, by most accounts, the second wealthiest monastery in England, behind only Westminster. That kind of wealth and reputation didn't just sit there, it pulled people. Pilgrims came for the abbey's relics and its claimed connections to the earliest history of English Christianity. And pilgrims, unlike passing merchants, arrive in waves tied to the religious calendar. Feast days, saints' days, the pull of a specific story, rather than the general churn of trade. An abbey that important couldn't just let those visitors fend for themselves in whatever spare rooms the town happened to have. So around 1475, Abbot John Selwood had a purpose-built hospitium put up right outside the abbey precinct, what later became known as the George and Pilgrim's Inn. This wasn't a repurposed farmhouse with a spare loft. It was designed from the ground up as a guest house, roughly 14 chambers, a 3-story stone-faced front divided into ornate paneled tiers, a grand entrance arch, and carved panels above the door bearing the arms of both the abbey and King Edward IV. That last detail matters more than it looks. Putting the monarch's coat of arms on your inn's facade, next to your own, is not the move of a modest operation. It's a statement about who this place belongs to and who it answers to. And that's the real structural difference between this inn and the more familiar picture of a medieval roadside tavern catching general travel traffic. A market town inn near a busy road survives on the ordinary churn of merchants, officials, and travelers moving between places for their own unrelated reasons. This inn survives on one specific institution's ability to keep drawing pilgrims to one specific town. Historians studying England's later medieval towns have found a rough hierarchy to how many inns a place could support. Provincial capitals might carry 10 to 20 of them, an ordinary market town 2 to 5, a small town often just the one. Glastonbury's inn sits in a narrower category still. Not a general-purpose stopover, but a specialist operation built around a single, specific draw. You also, notably, don't build this yourself. The pattern across documented English inns of this period is that the heavy capital, the walls, the stonework, the roof, comes from an institution, a monastery, a college, a wealthy individual lord looking for a long-term income property. Winchester College did exactly this with an inn it built in the market town of Andover around the same period, laying out roughly £400 in construction costs and then renting the finished building out to a tenant who ran the day-to-day operation. Glastonbury Abbey is doing the same thing here, just with a narrower, more specialized customer base walking through the door. You come in underneath that capital as the operator, the person actually running the place, hiring the staff, buying the stock, and hoping the arrangement pays. The record trail actually lets us see this handover happening in slow motion. The building's first documented tenant appears in 1439, decades before the current stone facade went up, running whatever more modest structure stood on the site at the time. It's only in 1493, under Abbot Selwood's successor, that the abbey hands over what the records call a new building to the abbey's own chamberlain, the official responsible for its finances, rather than to an outside tenant. That single change tells you something about how seriously the institution took this asset. A building important enough to warrant direct oversight from your own internal treasurer, rather than being farmed out entirely to a stranger, is a building the owner considers core to its operations, not a side property collecting incidental rent. Think about what that means for you as the person actually working the floor. You're not dealing with an absentee landlord who shows up once a year to collect a fixed sum and otherwise leaves you alone. You're operating inside an institution's own reputation management. The quality of the beds, the manners of the staff, the honesty of the ale, all of it reflects on the abbey whose coat of arms is carved above your door. A market town innkeeper who overcharges a merchant risks losing that one customer. You, running the abbey's guest house, risk becoming the story pilgrims tell when they get home about how Glastonbury treated them. The pressure to perform isn't just commercial. It's borrowed prestige, and borrowed prestige comes with strings attached that a plain roadside tavern keeper never has to think about. So, say you take the job. Before a single pilgrim walks through that carved archway, you've got a building to fill with everything a working inn actually needs, and none of it arrives for free just because the abbey owns the walls. Bed frames, mattresses, sheets, blankets, spares for whatever gets torn or stained or simply wears out under 14 rooms worth of turnover. Tables and benches and cups for the hall, brewing vessels, an oven, cooking equipment for the kitchen, straw, hay, and grain if you're keeping horses and stabling for pilgrims who arrived on them, and then opening stock on top of the equipment, malted grain, ale, bread, meat, fish, cheese, candles, firewood, all bought and paid for before a single guest hands you a coin. Some of that stock spoils. Some feeds your own household. Some quietly disappears in a servant's apron. None of it is optional, and all of it has to be funded up front out of your own working capital, well before the business generates a single penny of return. And you're not just running a guest house, you're running a brewery and a bakery too, because that's how these operations kept quality up and costs down. Most innkeepers of this period malted, mashed, and brewed their own ale in-house rather than buying it in, and baked their own bread rather than depending on an outside supplier who might cut corners you'd be blamed for. That's more equipment, more fuel, more skilled labor, and more things that can go wrong on any given week. It also means you're operating directly under one of medieval England's oldest and most actively enforced pieces of commercial regulation, the assize of bread and ale. Dating back to the 13th century, it set standards for the price, quality, and strength of what you sold, tied to the going rate of grain, and it was enforced by ale tasters, local officials whose actual job was to sample your product and report you if it fell short. Get caught selling weak or watered ale, or bread made from spoiled grain, and the penalties ranged from a fine to public humiliation, sometimes literally having the offending batch poured out in front of a crowd. For an ordinary alehouse keeper, that's an embarrassing Tuesday. For you, running the inn that carries the abbey's own coat of arms on its front wall, a public ale-tasting failure isn't just a fine. It's a story that travels home with every pilgrim who heard about it, attached to the abbey's name as much as yours. Staffing runs on the same logic as everywhere else in medieval. Hospitality, mostly family, filled out with hired hands. A spouse handling stores, brewing, and accounts. Children and relatives fetching water, changing bedding, carrying dishes. Paid servants covering the jobs that need real skill or round-the-clock coverage, tending horses, cooking, watching the gate long after everyone else has gone to bed. Family labor keeps your cash wage bill lower than it looks on paper, but it isn't free. That household still needs food, clothing, and lodging, and whatever's left over at year's end is what actually counts as your income, not the gross revenue the inn brings in. The one thing you can't smooth out with good staffing is the shape of your demand. A market town inn on a busy road gets something close to a steady trickle of travelers all year. A pilgrimage inn gets waves, Pilgrim traffic clusters around specific feast days, and saints' days tied to the abbey's religious calendar, which means your busiest weeks might be extraordinarily busy. Every bed full, the hall overflowing, stock running low by the second night, while the gaps in between run thin. That's a harder business to staff and stock than steady traffic because you're paying for capacity you need only a fraction of the time and running short exactly when the crowd that matters most is watching. Credit adds another layer of risk that's easy to miss if you only look at the price list. Pilgrims weren't merchants carrying a purse full of coin for a single transaction. Many traveled on limited means, stretching what they had across a long journey, and it wasn't unusual for a traveler to settle part of a bill on the promise of payment later, or to leave a small good in pledge against a debt they'd clear on the way home. That's manageable when it's the odd guest here and there. It becomes a real cash flow problem when a feast day crowd fills every bed at once and a meaningful share of that revenue is sitting on your books as a promise rather than money in hand. You still owe your grain supplier and your ale tasters good opinion regardless of whether your guests have settled up, which means part of your working capital has to exist purely to cover the gap between a full house and a full strongbox. Nor were you the only inn in town competing for that same pilgrim traffic. Studies of comparable English towns in this period have found dozens of households operating as inns or hostelries within a single mid-sized town at once. One estimate for Ipswich puts the figure at around 55 separate inn-keeping households across just a few decades in the 15th century. Glastonbury's pilgrimage economy likely supported a similar spread of competing lodgings, from the Abbey's own flagship guesthouse down to smaller, humbler operations catching the overflow. Standing next to the Abbey and wearing its coat of arms bought you prestige and a shot at the wealthier pilgrims. It didn't buy you a monopoly on beds. None of this stopped people from taking these jobs seriously or from doing well at them. Innkeepers in this period weren't treated as menial labor. Surviving records show them among the wealthier and more prominent residents of their towns, men who sat on local juries, held minor civic offices, and in a handful of documented cases even ended up representing their towns in parliament. Running an inn well at this scale required exactly the kind of practical competence: managing credit, handling supply, reading a room full of strangers, that also made someone useful in local government. This wasn't a fallback trade. It was, for the people who did it successfully, a route into genuine local standing. So could you actually get rich running this place? For a useful comparison, look back at that other institutionally owned inn we mentioned earlier, the Angel at Andover, built by Winchester College. The college's own paperwork shows it went in hoping for around £10 a year in rent from the finished building. What it actually collected, across the stretch of records historians have been able to piece together between 1456 and 1532, ran closer to £7 to £10 a year. A real income, and not a small one, but consistently landing at or below what the landlord itself had projected going in. Even the people financing these buildings, with every incentive to be optimistic, tended to overshoot their own returns. That's worth sitting with before you picture yourself getting wealthy off one of these. For an ordinary market town inn, the risks to that income are the familiar ones. A bad harvest driving up grain costs, a washed-out road keeping travelers away, a slow year for trade in general. Uncomfortable, but survivable, because the underlying reason people travel that road doesn't go away. A pilgrimage inn carries a different kind of risk entirely, one baked into the whole model from the start. Your income isn't tied to trade routes or harvests, it's tied to one institution's continued religious authority and its ability to keep drawing pilgrims to one specific town. And within about 60 years of that stone facade going up, that exact foundation would be gone. The dissolution of the monasteries in the late 1530s stripped English abbeys of their lands, their income, and in Glastonbury's case, eventually the abbey itself. A market town inn tied to ordinary trade could shrug that off. An inn built specifically to house pilgrims visiting a monastery had no such cushion. The entire reason people got off their horses at your door could, in principle, be legislated out of existence. And it wasn't a slow fade you could see coming for decades and plan around. Glastonbury Abbey itself was suppressed in 1539. its last abbot executed, its lands seized by the crown within the same sweep of legislation that closed monasteries across the country. The building you'd spent years running didn't vanish. It passed into the hands of the Duke of Somerset, and later tenants kept operating it as a hotel and inn for centuries afterward, right up to today. But the pilgrimage that justified building 14 guest chambers with the Abbey's coat of arms over the door was gone almost overnight, and whoever was running the place at that moment had to find an entirely new reason for travelers to keep showing up, with essentially no warning and no say in the decision. So here's the honest answer. Run this inn well during the years the pilgrimage economy is intact, and you likely do become one of the more comfortable, more respected people in Glastonbury. Solid income, real local standing, maybe even a seat on a jury or in local government somewhere down the line. But you'd be doing it on land you don't own, under a coat of arms you don't control, in a business whose entire customer base exists because of a religious institution's continued authority rather than anything you built yourself. That's not nothing. It's just a very different kind of wealth than it looks like from the outside, comfortable, prestigious, and in the end, only as durable as the abbey standing behind it. If you liked going behind the numbers on this one, that's basically what this channel does. We take a historical business that sounds simple from the outside and actually open the books on it. Let me know down in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really do read through those. And if you want to see more of these, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with what historical business you'd want opened up next.